In 1737, a detailed city map was published, not a sketch, not a symbolic illustration, a measured, structured, administrative map. It showed defined districts, aligned streets, integrated waterways, clearly marked ports and civic centers. Nothing about it felt experimental, nothing about it looked temporary. It looked finished. And yet, according to official records, the same city was still considered developing at that time. In some accounts, barely emerging. In others, only recently formalized. So, how can something appear fully structured before it is officially mature? Maps are not imaginative works of art. They are tools. They exist to control space, to manage taxation, to coordinate defense, to define ownership. No one invests time and resources mapping chaos, which means something simple, but powerful. If a city is mapped in detail, it is already stabilized. But stabilization takes time. Street grids do not align themselves in a decade. Canal systems do not self-organize in a generation. District names do not standardize without history behind them. Urban maturity is layered, and this is where the timeline starts to feel tighter than it should, because when you examine some of these early maps closely, what you see is not a city in progress. You see a city in equilibrium. Pause for a moment. Let that sink in. A city in equilibrium requires time. It requires iteration, correction, refinement, which leads to a question that feels small at first, but grows quickly the longer you sit with it. If a city already appears complete on its earliest surviving map, how long did it take to reach that point? That question is not dramatic. It is not conspiratorial. It is structural, because maps don't show beginnings. They show conditions, and conditions imply a past that is often longer than the date printed in the corner. So perhaps the real mystery is not whether these cities existed. Perhaps the mystery is this: are we mistaking the moment of documentation for the moment of origin? And if we are, what phase of development happened quietly before anyone decided to draw the lines? If we are going to question the timeline, we first have to understand what a map really is. A map is not a story. It is not a prediction. It is not aspiration. A map is a record of what is stable enough to measure. Cartographers did not draw cities that were still shifting every year. They mapped territory that had already settled into recognizable order. Because mapping is expensive, time-consuming, political. It requires surveyors, funding, authority. No government invests those resources to document something temporary, which means something very simple, but very important. A mapped city is a city that is already stabilized. Now pause here. Because stabilization is not the same as foundation. A foundation can be chaotic, messy, irregular. Stabilization is what comes after expansion slows and systems align. Street grids stop shifting. District names stop changing. Water routes are standardized. Administrative zones are formalized. Only then does a city become legible enough to map precisely. And when we look at some 18th century maps, that precision is already there. We see symmetry, we see alignment, we see integrated canal systems feeding directly into coordinated port structures. That level of cohesion doesn't appear in infancy. It appears after iteration. This is where the rhythm changes, because if the earliest surviving map shows a city already functioning in equilibrium, then what we are seeing is not a beginning. We are seeing a moment after refinement. Personally, this is where the narrative stopped feeling linear to me. I used to think maps marked the birth of cities, but the more I studied them, the more they looked like snapshots taken long after the early phases had passed, which creates a subtle tension in the timeline. If official history assigns a foundation date near the time the map appears, and the map already reflects maturity, then the documented beginning may not be the real beginning at all. It may be the moment governance caught up to what already existed, and that difference matters because it shifts our perception from creation to continuation. Which brings us to a quiet but growing question. If a city only becomes visible in records once it stabilizes, how long was it evolving before anyone drew its outline? That question doesn't accuse. It doesn't speculate wildly. It simply asks us to reconsider what a map represents. Maps do not capture infancy. They capture order, and order implies time. Time that often stretches further back than the ink suggests. And once you see that, you can't quite look at old maps the same way again. Let's examine something most people never pause to consider. Urban maturity leaves fingerprints, not in legends, not in dramatic events, but in structure. A city that has just been founded looks uneven. Roads misalign, districts overlap, boundaries shift, infrastructure adapts. Early cities are messy. They evolve through friction. But when we look at some early cartographic records, we don't see that friction. We see balance. We see symmetry. We see canal systems feeding into organized port districts. We see street grids aligning across multiple zones. We see administrative quarters already differentiated from commercial ones. That is not infancy. That is refinement. And refinement implies iteration. Iteration implies time. This is where the logic tightens. Because if a city appears refined in its earliest detailed representation, then one of two things must be true. Either development happened unusually fast, or we're not looking at the true beginning. Now, pause here. Because the instinct is to assume speed. But speed does not explain integration. Rapid growth creates expansion. It does not create equilibrium. Equilibrium comes after growth stabilizes, after corrections are made, after patterns settle, and this is where the tension becomes impossible to ignore. If the earliest surviving maps already show equilibrium, then the unstable phase, the formative phase, is missing from view, not necessarily erased, just absent from documentation. Personally, this was the moment that shifted everything for me. I realized I had always assumed that the first map marked the birth of a city's complexity, but what if it marks the moment complexity was organized? Those are two very different milestones, because organization often follows disruption, and disruption rarely leaves clean records. Which leads us to a deeper question. If equilibrium appears suddenly in the historical record, what transitional phase happened before it? Cities do not skip adolescence. They grow into structure. Unless we are only seeing the phase after reorganization. And that possibility does not require dramatic reinterpretation. It requires us to acknowledge something simple. Documentation often begins at clarity, not at chaos, and maps, by nature, favor clarity, which means they may be showing us the stabilized layer of a city, not the phase when it first struggled into existence. And if that's true, then the timeline we inherit may begin later than we think. If the first clear map shows maturity, are we mistaking stabilization for origin? There is something subtle about the way history begins. It rarely begins in chaos. It begins in order. Governments issue charters after control is established. Archives record boundaries after disputes settle. Maps are drawn after streets stop shifting. History prefers clarity. But life, especially urban life, rarely starts that way. Cities are born through friction, through expansion and collapse, through mistakes, corrections and reinventions. Yet, when we open the record, what we often find is not struggle. We find structure. This is the point where I had to slow down, because I realized something uncomfortable. I had always trusted official dates as markers of origin. But the more I studied old maps and administrative documents, the more those dates felt like moments of consolidation, not creation. And that difference changes everything. When a city receives a formal designation, it doesn't suddenly materialize. It formalizes what has already stabilized, which means documentation may begin at the moment of reorganization, not at the moment of emergence. Pause here. Let that settle. If records begin after stability, then instability remains undocumented. If charters follow consolidation, then consolidation follows something else, something less tidy. This is not dramatic. It is human. Civilizations reorganize constantly. They reclassify. They rename. They redraw. And when they do, the new framework becomes the beginning in the archive. But beneath that beginning, there may be earlier phases that were never fully catalogued. The first time I overlaid an 18th century map onto a modern city plan, I expected divergence. I expected primitive outlines that later matured. Instead, I saw continuity. Streets extended. District cores remained anchored. Waterways persisted in shape and alignment. It didn't look like a city that had been born. It looked like a city that had been reorganized, and that was the moment the linear story stopped feeling complete. Not wrong, incomplete, because if a city's documented foundation coincides with its administrative reset rather than its physical emergence, then the beginning is not truly the start, it is the start of the next layer, which raises a question that lingers long after you close the archive. If documentation begins at stabilization, how much urban life unfolded before anyone decided to record it? That question is not about hidden empires. It is about silence. About the quiet gaps between phases. Cities do not blink into existence fully formed. They transition, and transitions are messy. But messy periods rarely produce neat maps, which means the first map we see may not show us birth. It may show us survival. And if that is true, then the earliest visible layer of a city may not be its first. It may simply be the first layer that endured long enough to be drawn. If our historical timeline starts at clarity, what chapters unfolded in the shadow just before it? And once that thought enters your mind, it becomes very difficult to look at old maps as simple beginnings ever again. Now we arrive at the part that is hardest to ignore, because once you accept that documentation may begin after stabilization, you start noticing something else. Some cities don't just appear organized, they appear finished. On certain 18th century maps, you don't see tentative growth, you see coordinated geometry, canals feeding into balanced port districts, major roads radiating outward with proportional spacing, administrative quarters separated clearly from commercial zones. This isn't early development, this is system-level design, and systems do not mature instantly. They evolve through correction, through failure, through adaptation, which means refinement leaves a trail, unless that trail was never mapped. Pause here. Imagine a city going through expansion, crisis, restructuring. During those phases, nothing is stable enough to draw precisely, but once equilibrium returns, once authority consolidates, once systems align, that is when someone measures, that is when someone draws, and that drawing becomes the earliest surviving image. But the drawing does not show the turbulence, it shows the calm that followed it. The first time I noticed this pattern, it wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. A harbor that felt too integrated for its supposed age, a street grid that seemed too confident for its assigned foundation year. It wasn't impossible, it was improbable. And improbability is quieter than impossibility. It doesn't scream, it lingers, because cities do not wake up symmetrical. Symmetry is earned through iteration, earned through correction, earned through time. Which means if symmetry appears suddenly in the archive, then the earning happened earlier. possibly earlier than the record begins. This is where the emotional weight starts to settle in, because it forces you to reconsider what you mean by beginning. If the first official map already shows maturity, then we're not witnessing birth. We are witnessing inheritance, and inheritance suggests continuity, not mystery, continuity, which leads to a question that grows heavier the longer you hold it. If the first visual record shows a city already refined, what phase of refinement happened before that moment? And perhaps even more quietly, are we confusing the first surviving layer with the first existing one? Cities are not single events, they are accumulations, layer upon layer. And sometimes the earliest visible layer is not the earliest that existed, only the earliest that endured. And once you recognize that, the map stops feeling like an origin point. It begins to feel like a midpoint. When a city appears too complete too early, the instinct is to look for error. But what if the issue isn't error? What if it's compression? History does not preserve every phase equally. It highlights moments of clarity, moments of consolidation, moments when systems settle into recognizable form. Everything before that often becomes background. Not erased, just simplified. And simplification can quietly compress decades, sometimes even generations, into a single administrative date. This is where the idea of timeline compression becomes powerful, because compression does not mean deception. It means condensation. A city may expand chaotically for years, then face disruption, political, economic, environmental, then reorganize under new authority. When that reorganization stabilizes, documentation begins. The reorganization becomes the foundation. But the physical city, the streets, the canals, the districts, may predate that formal moment, which means the map records consolidation, not creation. Pause here. Let that distinction settle. Creation is messy, consolidation is neat. Maps prefer neatness, and archives prefer stability, which means instability. The formative turbulence often disappears from the record. The more I considered this, the less mysterious old maps became. They stopped feeling like anomalies. They started feeling like survivors of transitional phases that were never fully documented. If we inherit only the stabilized layer, then naturally it will look sudden. Naturally, it will look as if complexity appeared all at once. But the suddenness is often an illusion created by missing chapters, which leads to a question that feels increasingly difficult to ignore. If our earliest maps reflect consolidation, how much development unfolded before stability returned? And perhaps even more quietly, are we mistaking the moment order was restored for the moment everything began? Cities accumulate, they layer, they adapt, and sometimes the layer that survives becomes the first layer we can see. But visibility is not origin, and documentation is not birth. Once you accept that possibility, the maps stop looking like contradictions. They start looking like windows. Windows into a city that was already older than its first official line of ink. Old maps are quiet. They do not argue. They do not accuse. They do not speculate. They simply draw lines. But lines imply structure, and structure implies time. Time spent measuring. Time spent organizing. Time spent refining. If a city appears mature on its earliest surviving map, perhaps the question is not whether the city should exist. Perhaps the question is when it became stable enough to be drawn, and that is a different kind of inquiry. Because stability often follows disruption, consolidation often follows change, and documentation often follows consolidation, which means what we see as a beginning may actually be a continuation. The more I sit with old maps, the less I feel they contradict history. And the more I feel they expose something subtle about how history is written. It begins where order returns, not where life first stirred. There is something humbling about that. It reminds us that archives are selective. They preserve clarity, but Clarity is only one phase of a much longer process. Cities are not single events. They are accumulations, layered through growth, tension, reorganization, and survival. And sometimes the first layer we can see is not the first that existed. It is simply the first that endured long enough to be measured. So perhaps old maps are not showing cities that shouldn't exist. Perhaps they're showing cities that already had a past by the time we started counting. That thought does not require conspiracy. It requires patience, a willingness to see timelines not as straight lines, but as layered surfaces. And that brings us to a final, quiet question. If our historical records begin at stabilization, what earlier phases of urban life unfolded just before clarity returned? Not hidden, not erased, simply unrecorded. Because sometimes the most important part of history is not what is written on the map. It is what had already happened before the ink ever touched the page. And once you consider that possibility, old maps begin to feel less like beginnings and more like midpoints.